Hi everyone, welcome back to Coffee with Kirsten. This is episode 2. Last episode we talked about translation, what a good translation of the Bible is, what version I should be reading, all that good stuff. So we have a good starting point. So now, over the next couple weeks, we're going to be going cover to cover on how to read every genre of the Bible. So, everyone likes to think of the Bible as one book. And it is. It's one overarching story of God. But it's actually 66 smaller books. And a lot of those have different genres. Now, the Old Testament, which people love to not look at and read, makes up 3/4 of the Bible. And 40% of that, so a large portion of even just the Bible, is made up of historical narratives. So historical narratives are stories, right? So these make up Genesis, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Jonah, and Haggai. Exodus, Numbers, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Job also have substantial portions of historical narrative. We're covering a lot of ground there, right? And a lot of people think that it's not important to read the Old Testament. But Christ talks about, and Paul, how we've been grafted into the tree of Israel. So we're adopted into that history. So in order to know who we are now, we need to know where our people have been. So knowing our history is really important. That's why you take history class in school. We need to do the same thing with our biblical heritage. So the Old Testament is made up of a lot of stories, right? And these stories are made up into 3 parts. So the Bible itself is what we call meta-narrative. So that's the big picture, as big as you can get. So that's God's A to B. So creation to redemption, new earth, right? That's God's big overarching story. That's the foundational level. Second level is the redemptive history. So the history of God's people, how He saved them, and kind of how they're working right now. So a lot of this is Old Covenant, New Covenant kind of stuff. That's the second level. Then we move up to individual stories. These are like the stories of Moses and Joshua and Jonah, and all those little stories that we read. So as we're reading those little stories, we need to be thinking about layers 1 and 2, right? Because everything is written out of God's big story. And most of them are written about how God is saving His people, how He's working through them. So we can see this in almost every story. And when we start to look for those things, the stories become so rich. And you get to start to see how God's kind of working. So that's the really first important step that we do when we're reading narrative. So Hebrew literature, right? Obviously, we talked about how it's a very different language, and it was written in a very different time. So Hebrew stories were not meant to be read by yourself in your house, right? Jewish tradition states they should be said aloud, and they should be read in a community, right? They shouldn't be read by yourself. And they were meant to be told around a campfire, in community with your family. So they don't read like a normal story does. They're very dialogue heavy. They contain all the same normal points like plot, characters, and some tension, that sort of thing. All those things you go over in English class. They contain all of that. But Hebrew literature is a lot more subtle than English literature. So a lot of things are kind of implied. A lot of things are explicit, but a lot of things go unsaid. And there's this certain understanding that you kind of are aware of the rest of the story, right? So that you know the law, that you have grown up with it. So a lot of times, Old Testament stories, and I say that there's some historical narrative in the New Testament, but not as much. So I'm just going to refer to it as the Old Testament stories, but these happen to real people. Right, so these stories have a lot of subtle meaning. And this can cause a lot of problems for us because we as modern readers don't know the dangers of reading these, right? We don't know what to expect, so we just read it the way that we're taught. But this can get us into a lot of trouble. When we start reading stories, we often like to read them as like fairy tales or fables, right? We like to look for morals in them because that's the kind of stories that we grew up on. This is not how Hebrew stories work. These are strictly history. So these are strictly telling things that happened. They might illustrate moral points, but they never themselves directly teach it. You'll never hear in an Old Testament story like, this was how Moses was bad. They might point to things where God has said it explicitly in the Bible, right? The 10 Commandments, do not lie, do not steal, do not kill, right? The dreaded book of Leviticus, really important to read because it comes right out and says a lot of the morals and how we're supposed to live. These histories are not meant to teach us these morals. And because of that, we often read morals into the stories, but that's not what we're supposed to do. And because of that, we often want to look to these Bible characters as heroes. And they are. They're champions of the faith. God used them for a reason. But it's really important to remember that they're people. So they're fallen. They're broken. And they got a lot of messed up junk going on. One of the reasons why I love the Old Testament is because it's made up of some of the most messed up people that you'll read about. Liars, murderers, people selling family members off, multiple people trying to convince kings that their wives are their sisters. Like just a bunch of weird stuff. And God uses that in the second level of his redemptive history. So we need to be aware that while we can apply things from these stories, that's not their original intent. Their intent is to tell us the stories of our people. And out of that, we need to remember these stories are not about us, right? So these aren't personal stories. Jeremiah 29:11, great example of this. We love writing it on our yearbooks and talking about it, and it is a source of comfort. But we really need to remember where that quote comes from. Jeremiah, a prophet, telling the nation Israel that they're going to be evicted from their homeland. Everything they know, they're going to be given to this pagan nation, and they're going to be forced into these lives where they can't follow God. They're losing everything. And it's a part of a history, and it's not speaking to you directly. Does that mean we can't take comfort out of that? No, we can, because God elsewhere has said, I have a plan for you, all that kind of thing. God has said it elsewhere, so it's okay for us to do it. When we start picking and choosing little verses out of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, becomes really dangerous. That's called decontextualizing. And that's a fancy way to say we forget the big picture. So in the Old Testament, it's meant to be read through the lens of the first and second level, right? God's big story and his redemptive story. So if we start just reading bits here and there, or reading chapters and verses, then we lose a lot of the meaning, and we can often get things wrong really easily, and we can misquote things. There was a saying in college, a text without context is a pretext to a proof text. What does that mean? That means if I just cherry pick out of the Bible, I can prove whatever I want with these verses. That's why it's so important to read the books of the Bible in context. If you get nothing else out of this video, read the background, read the histories, right? This is why I recommend you have a study Bible above all else. Study Bibles have these, so this, right? And it has all the dates, the histories, the themes. It even has maps in it, right? So it does the work for you. And then as you're reading, it has the context and all the little details and other places where God is saying the same thing. Study Bibles are your best friend. You really want to get one of these because it makes sure that you're not decontextualizing, taking things out of context, saying the wrong things. it's really easy to do with narratives because we tend to see it just as one individual picture, but it's meant to be read in a much bigger sense. And so that's really the big pitfall with historical narratives. And because we're never taught how to read them, it's really easy to slip into that. To make stories say things that they don't actually say. Or pick out weird details that we don't know the background of. The book of Ruth is a really good example of this. And that's the historical narrative that I recommend you read. You should always read books of the Bible in one big chunk. Never start in the middle, unless you're almost never start in the middle when you're just reading on your own. Ruth is short and contained. It is at a very specific time in biblical history, and you should go look up all of this on your own. And it talks a lot about laws, like the gleaning laws, and why that's important, and why it's so important that Boaz acted the way he did. It's not just a love story. It plays such a beautiful part in the overarching narrative of God, and when you appreciate the context, everything going on back here in the book of Ruth, it becomes so much more beautiful. It's not just about Ruth finding her Boaz, drives me nuts, but it's about God redeeming the lives of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And Boaz we can look to as a really good example because elsewhere in the Bible it explicitly states that Boaz is supposed to be doing these things. So that's a wonderful example of historical narrative, and it's a good practice point. Practice reading the context. Look things up. Be inquisitive, right? Don't be lazy with your Bible reading. It's so important that you look things up. Because if we don't, we get into really dangerous waters. Another good book to read is Judges. Judges plays a really important part in the big story of the redemptive history of Israel, stuff like King David. But there's a lot of subtleties that don't come out until you look into the history. And that's why in Breakfast Club I drive you guys a little nuts sometimes on Sunday morning class. It's because I love getting into that nitty-gritty detail, because that's where God shows how much he's in those little details, right? That's where he shows how much he cares. He thinks about these tiny little things and he has them all plotted out. And it is just the coolest thing. So get yourself a study Bible, look some of this stuff up, have fun with it. Read some of the Judges stories. They're nuts. But they're a lot of fun, and they play an important part in Israel's history, in our history. So I encourage you, read the historical narratives, get into them, they're fun, and know that you're a part of that story. You're a part of that narrative. Maybe you're not written in there, but God is using you in the same ways that he's using those people, and he wants to teach you through those narratives. So enjoy them, have fun, read some of the Old Testament. I always love it. We'll talk up next week on Sunday about my favorite part of the Old Testament. We're going to tackle the Old Testament law. So I'll see you then, guys. Have fun.